Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 17th of March and it's almost the 18th by now, so this video will be concise. We're looking at numerous updates all across the front line, beginning with Zaporizhia because we do have Russian advances over there, ending with the Kursk region. We're going to look at a holistic frontline summary today. And there are a lot of different claims. So there, of course, will be variations when it comes to the reporting about the extent of certain advances, which is why I'm trying to be pretty conservative with my estimates and focusing on as much on geolocated footage as possible, because some of these are rather new updates from areas of the front line that have not encountered as much activity. It's going to be expected that at first there won't be as much footage to back things up, which is why I'm just going to give warnings whenever that's the case. But beginning over here with Zaporizhia, you can see this is the western sector of the front line over here in Zaporizhia Oblast, an area that's seen very little high intensity fighting. There have been artillery duels and FPV strikes going on a daily basis, of course. And the latest sort of high intensity fighting that actually saw some sort of movement was in Kamyansk. I believe this was in January or actually going into February, because there was a localized Ukrainian counterattack that allowed them to take control over the southern portion of the town. But that was about it. For the most part, the front line was static. You can see it based on this red polygon indicating the previous line of contact before the most recent Russian advances. And it's an area where the Ukrainians were able to retain some control over the villages they captured during the summer 2023 counteroffensive, although they lost control of almost every single gain they made a bit to the east in the Orkiv sector. And we'll get to that in a moment. But over here, the Russians are actually beginning to reverse some of those 23 counteroffensive gains. You can see they captured 22.5 square kilometers of territory, largely consisting of open fields in areas that do actually have a lot of dense dugouts, but don't have a lot of infantry to man every single individual defensive point. And the Russian forces took advantage of some of these gaps and were able to advance a couple of kilometers northwards. We'll see over here it's an advance amounting to 4.6 kilometers, and we're able to enter into the village of Mali Shcherbaki, running along this horizontal highway that then arrives into Novoandrivka and then Orkiv. So this is an area that we know for sure the Russians are located in because of a video from today, March 17th, from the Luftwaffe drone units, and also in conjunction with the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. We all know this unit by now. It's pretty infamous. They had a long period, I would say maybe even a year, of basically zero frontline contact. Then a couple of months ago, they got integrated into the fighting near Vuhledar and Velika Novostilka. Then they also received a couple of months of reprieve before being redeployed back to the Zaporizhia region, where they're currently one of the main units manning in this part of the front line, albeit they're not receiving that much support. But that's a bit of a tangent. What my main point is that they were striking individual Russian soldiers as they made it into the houses in Malishtribaki, and you could see how Russian soldiers have already arrived at the halfway points. And that means that everything north of the highway is likely a gray zone wherein there are no solid Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians are located further northwards in various ditches and tree lines, and they also have a presence remaining in the hamlet of Shcherbaki. There are some claims by Russian sources of their elements entering into this village already, but nothing backs it up so far, so we'll have to keep a keen eye out for videos. There are a couple of other units operating in this region that could pose a defensive threat. So you have the 23rd Public Protection Brigade of the National Guard. And a lot of these are just ancillary units, a part of the National Guard that were created over the past 2 to 3 years, that were deployed to areas of the front line that were of the lowest priority in order to free up space for other more trained units to fight in key areas. There are a couple of other examples. You have several battalions that are independent in this region, and I have battalions of 128th Brigade marked over here. And then over here, you have the 12th Special Purpose Detachment of the National Guard. So really, it is a small grouping over here. Russian forces were also able to advance into Pyatikhatki, and this isn't the first time they advanced. On February 27th, the attacks over here started, and the 2nd Mountain Assault Battalion of 128th Brigade, they conducted grenade drops onto those individual Russian soldiers as they entered into the village, but it was not enough. And in recent days, Russian soldiers have been able to further expand control in this hamlet, taking it over in its entirety, whereas Ukrainian forces are still operating around the warehouses of Lobkove. And then a bit to the north, you also have the village of Lobkove, which remains under Ukrainian control. A lot of these villages, once again, were taken over during the counteroffensive and serve as a final line of villages before you reach this large open region, which spans at most 7 kilometers from the line of contact to the Ukrainian defensive line, which serves as the first significant line of Ukrainian defense. And you could see that it really is formidable in the sense that it does contain a lot of anti-tank ditches, dugouts, trenches, and the like. Ukrainians really did put in a lot of investment into building up this line along with a perimeter of Western Orikhiv, and then a secondary line behind that. The area that's sort of the least covered by these defenses is the area that's closest to the Dnieper River. And that's an area that hopefully, from a Ukrainian perspective, they would be able to concentrate most of their focus on if there were to be some sort of Russian advance. Most of the firepower could be directed in that region, but you can see how there is a bit of a gap over there, and it extends a bit further and becomes even wider over here with this sort of 19-kilometer gap in between the trenches that you see south of Komishuvacha and the actual riverbank. So that's something that's I found pretty interesting. But directly south of where the Russians are advancing, or directly north, I should say, it's an area that's very dense when it comes to fortifications. Before reaching that region, you do have a large area that consists of open fields and basically zero villages or soldiers that would be an area that the Russians could seize upon to get closer to, of course, the Ukrainian defenses. So definitely keep an eye for that and for the way in which this can eventually connect to the Orikhiv sector, because Orikhiv is, of course, one of the most important villages nearby. It serves as this crossroads between a lot of local routes and then extends in all directions. So the Russians are definitely improving that western flank that has a road running into the city. And also just south of Novo Danilivka, the Russian forces advanced 1.6 square kilometers. This is a video from, I believe, March 9th, and it's from the 65th Brigade. They conducted FPV strikes onto Russian infantry north of Robotyne. Now let's move on to the situation in Velika Novosilka. You can see over here there are 3 territorial advances by the Russian side. First of all, March 17th, 17th National Guard Brigade, one of the key units involved with stabilizing the front line near Privilny and Vilnopole. They conducted shelling of Russian soldiers as they were operating in trenches that were built by the Ukrainian side, built as a means of stalling Russian advances because of the fears that have consistently reiterated of a Russian breakthrough in between the defense line that runs from Donetsk and then westwards into Dnipro Oblast, and then the trench line that is sort of an extension of the trenches I was talking about previously near Orikhiv. It extends all the way westwards, or I should say eastwards, all the way past Huliapoli and pretty much close to the border with Donetsk. But then you have this sort of 10-kilometer opening between the first and second lines of defense over here. And it's an area that definitely is exposed as a result. And the Russians right now have a direct westwards line or vector of advance through which they can attack to reach this area. And so there are a couple of local defensive positions built in between, including the ones that the Russians captured south of Privilny, that are sort of meant to drag out the fighting, prevent that sort of scenario. But it's not unified in any way. So the Russians, of course, were operating through those regions and used it as a coordinating point to attack towards villages that are nearby and under Ukrainian control, but were shelled by the 17th Brigade. So you can see that there was an advance amounting to almost 6.6 square kilometers of territory. So we're looking at large territorial advances through open areas for the most parts. And then over here on the road to Vasile, it's another 3.1 square kilometers of territory captured. This is a video from March 16th. It's from the 110th Mechanized Brigade, showing their shelling of the fields south of the hamlets. And of course, now you could see clearly on the map that the Russians are very close to reaching the line of defense that runs through this entire Mokrieli River Valley region. And it's not just exclusive to the villages that are along the riverbank, but also to all the positions that are further to the west, either in Donetsk or in Dnipro Oblast, which will be penetrated as a result. Besides that, you also have this Russian advance west of Rozdolnia, amounting to about 2.3 square kilometers of territory. Just a bit of a strengthening of the front line along the eastern bank of the river, where you have the 20th Special Purpose Battalion of the Presidential Brigade operating, trying to maintain the defensive posture. Besides that, I want to go look at the situation a bit to the east of Arkhangelsk and I suppose north of Avdiivka. It's an area that really has been quiet ever since the battle itself. So it's been quiet for a year now. We haven't seen advances over here. Okay, so the Russian forces advanced 3 square kilometers just to the west of Novobakhmutivka. This was on March 17th, and it was due to footage coming out of the 68th Tank Regiment. They operated with drone crews from the 20th Motor Rifle Division. Their sappers dismounted from a truck that was carrying them. They got out. They were able to enter into a tree line that consisted of several Ukrainian defensive positions, which were undermined and targeted as a result. And the geolocation itself shows that the Russians are operating just east of this local highway, this highway that then advances vertically northwards and connects to the highway that we all know of, the highway that the Russians are pretty close to cutting off, C0504, which then enters into Konstantinivka, one of the most dominant Ukrainian cities in the entire Donbass region that remains under their control. And so the Russians just were able to improve their tactical position over here. More generally, the Ukrainians have a solid line of contact running from Sukhabalka to Alexandropil that has been difficult to penetrate because of a lack of Russian ambition in doing so, and also just due to the tight knit garrison fortifications and higher elevation that the Ukrainians have under their disposal. So then an attack from the south would be a means of undermining that by flanking those positions that are sort of centered around repelling eastward attacks by also opening up a vector from the south. But again, the chances of that happening on a larger scale are low for now because there isn't as much of a troop deployment needed for such a thing. And then I would say the same thing for any sort of potential scenario of a Russian advance deeper past Zelenopole through these open fields where you see the arrows over here. Because on paper, this looks like a very practical advance for the Russians in order to seize control over large scale ridges, these ridges that are centered around the perimeter over here in red that would overlook the highway and would also overlook some of the positions west of Turetsk that remain under Ukrainian control and would probably in the long term give the Russians an opportunity to fully get control over the circle over here, the semicircle crest shape that I'm showing, that is needed in order to have a solid flank south of Konstantinivka. So in terms of like big arrow advances, this would be something that is practical on paper, but the troop deployment numbers just don't really indicate that there is the Russian desire to do so right now, although obviously it could change depending on what's done with the Russian garrison that's currently involved with fighting along the ring road of the T-0504. Perhaps they decide that it's not necessarily the most beneficial for them to continue going back and forth with the Ukrainian units over here, and they shift focus a bit to the east because that could actually have some longer term strategic benefits. But when it comes to the actual meat and potatoes of the front line today, I want to look at Turetsk because you can see that the Russians have been able to improve their situation significantly in several locations. So, first of all, just to the west of the rail station in the Centralna mine, Russian forces have been able to retake a large chunk of the populated areas that the Ukrainians used to initially infiltrate into the town center. You can see over here 22 hectares of territory, largely residential areas, as I said, and gardens. The Russian forces, with their shelling and airstrikes, caused enormous damage to the mine itself and to nearby facilities. And so they basically flattened a lot of those positions that the Ukrainians were trying to hold themselves up in, of course, barring the basements themselves. So Ukrainian forces had a difficult, they really had a large difficulties in resupplying whatever small garrison they had of just small squads operating in the center. Because imagine it, you have to, first of all, reach the opening, this very narrow opening to a salient that the Ukrainians have under their control right now, this 1 kilometer opening, and then you have this pretty deep salient that is isolated, enveloped on 3 sides. And then from there, you have to enter an even smaller salient to arrive at the center of a city that is also enveloped on 3 sides by Russian positions in populated areas and in apartment buildings. And so it's extremely difficult to do. And when you extrapolate it to a long term sort of scenario. And so for a couple of days, having a fluid front line is one thing, but then permanently maintaining positions against a more I suppose, disciplined and improved Russian garrison. And I say that because there were troop rotations by the Russian side in recent months. So you have over here 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade, part of the previous DPR army structure. It was rotated out of the fighting and largely replaced by the 103rd Motor Rifle Regiment and more generally by the 150th Division. And as a result of the training discipline, I suppose quality of the Russian garrison over here has improved as a result. And they're also more fresh now, so they're able to deal more actively with these Ukrainian maneuvers. So they've been playing a huge role in repelling these Ukrainian attacks. And that's what I was saying about the change in dynamics recently. And also this brigade or regiment, I should say, They recaptured 0.262 square kilometers of territory, including in northern Turetsk and Krimska. So you can see over here, this includes this entire outstretched salient that had the stadium and entered into some parts of the apartment complexes in the Citadel region, including some of these houses in residential areas, duplexes, gardens, basically every single service area in this north central part of Turetsk, and then sort of stretching into Krimsk as well. Certain portions of Krimsk were taken back by the Russian side, and the Russians were recorded at the entrances to the Krimsk mine, which does indicate that the front line is actually even further and even deeper into the Ukrainian positions than it was during the Russian maximum advances that occurred, I don't know, like 3 4 weeks ago. And there is an indication over here of the Ukrainians remaining close to the front line, close to where the Russians have advanced through, based on the geolocation from March 17th of the Ukrainian vehicle conducting troop rotations, undershelling in this populated area. But besides that, all of the nearby adjacent regions have been retaken by the Russian side. It's also been verified by Deep State. They claim that the situation is, of course, fluid, but the Russian forces, with those new reinforcements and with those rotations, they have recently been able to promote stabilization measures to the line of contact. But again, it's not the end of the fluidity, so there could be changes in vicissitudes, and it would be difficult then to map out the exact perimeter of Russian control, because according to Deep Sea, for instance, a lot of these western portions of Turetsk are actually just completely a gray zone. Areas that are further west, like you see over here with the salient, that is basically outside of this Turetsk urban area, and then also houses that are in the northwestern corner of Turetsk. A lot of those are still considered to be gray zone by Ukrainian sources. But again, we just haven't seen as much footage of a Ukrainian presence in the center of Turetsk through some of the most famous attack vectors in recent days, and that's largely because of the Russians succeeding in those counterattacks. Now, besides that, I want to look at Verkhnokamiansk, just north of that village. The Russians advanced 1.74 square kilometers. I don't know why I don't have the geolocation marked over here, but it was basically this group Spear B. It's a drone unit, a part of the 118th Territorial Defense Brigade. They just conducted FPV strikes targeting a whole host of Russian soldiers, either on Desert Cross ATVs or on foot, because they had to descend from those ATVs and tried hiding in bushes. So they were all struck, and as a result, Russians advanced about, let's see, what is 1.7 kilometers westwards, and this is a part of the Russians' development of the northern flank of this village, with the hopes of them squeezing out the remaining Ukrainian garrison in this region. The fighting is very methodical, and it's actually very costly from a material perspective. There is a large Russian contingent of armored vehicles deployed to this region, and they have been engaged in a lot of assaults recently. A lot of columns attacking north of Verkhnokamiansk through the ridges that are located to the northwest of Seversk, as I always reiterate. And it has led to marginal advances, but you can see there still is a lot of work to be done, and the costs are pretty high from a losses standpoint. There are a lot of vehicles, and now as a result, they try to diversify. They try to use ATVs or motorcycles or vehicles whenever possible, not just armored vehicles, but every single type gets damaged as a result by the Siversky grouping, which is very, very tight knit and has a very strong drone contingent. Also, over here, just west of the Zherbets River, the Russian forces were able to advance 6.3 square kilometers. They captured the entirety of Novolyubivka. This shows us that basically the entire western bank of the river is now under Russian control in this specific region, spanning from Makivka all the way to, let's see, Bilohorivka over here. The only exception would be just to the west of Balka Zhuravka, and that's an area that's currently exposed and disconnected from populated regions. So this is a really important capture and gain for the Russian side, because it gives them the ability to make inroads into the local trenches built by the Ukrainian side, advance along ridges to the next line of actual populated areas, as we said, including Novek, Katerinivka, Novomikhailivka. Those are areas where you actually do have Ukrainian deployments. And then everything in between becomes an opportunity for the Russians to turn their bridgehead into something even deeper, something even stronger that becomes the linchpin for future assaults that, of course, from the Russian perspective, would eventually squeeze out the eastern bank of the Zherbets River and then also reach Liman. But for now, that is not the main priority. They just want to further solidify themselves west of the river. And speaking of rivers, let's look at the Oska riverfront, because in Fikholivka, the Ukrainian side was able to repulse the Russian attacks, push them out of the village entirely, capture as a result 2.3 square kilometers of territory. So this allowed a stabilization of the front line, preventing the Russians from advancing along this paved road northwards towards numerous other villages, numerous other populated areas that could have easily fallen into Russian hands had there not been some form of Ukrainian resistance. And we see that the Ukrainian resistance and defensive measures have improved over here in recent weeks because of a small amount of reinforcements, but also just due to Ukrainian forces located over there getting used to the situation and being able to prevent active assaults from pushing even deeper into their lines. And so now the Russians have begun expanding their horizons, and their goal is to squeeze the Ukrainians out of Kamyanka. Kamyanka serves as the largest village remaining under their control. That's basically right next to the river. You can see it's pretty large in surface area and has a couple of houses and basements. So it's an area that the Ukrainians would like to retain control over because it serves as a center of gravity. And while it remains under Ukrainian control, the Russians can't really focus elsewhere at other locations nearby because they'll always have to deal with the harassment coming from the Ukrainian garrison over here. So then, from a Russian perspective, taking this over would be so important because then it would neuter any resistance from the 3rd Tank Brigade to the operations in Topoli, meaning that basically this entire line of hilly regions and the western bank of the river, all these open areas, including forested locations, they would all be under threat of complete Russian capture, and there wouldn't be a good area for the Ukrainians to actually put up resistance up until a couple of kilometers westwards when you actually reach the chains of villages that we discussed north of Fikholivka running over here. And those are areas that are not well prepared for defensive operations. There aren't a lot of trenches over there, and the rear is very scant. So definitely the Ukrainians would like to ensure the front line remains where it is right now in Kamyanka, but at the same time, you have the Russians attacking, capturing 3.7 square kilometers southwest of it, and then also over here 1.8 square kilometers to the east, trying to conduct a pincer maneuver against those Ukrainian forces. Now, moving on to the Kursk region, I want to zoom in, and this is an area where we have so much ambiguity, and that's why I'm going to, of course, explain the rationale behind the frontline updates. So, a lot of Russian sources have already called the capture of Guevo. There isn't a solid geolocation of the 177th Marine Regiment entering into the village. The only proof we have is of a drone, allegedly was a drone that it was able to, of course, put up the Russian flag atop the telecom tower that is right next to Guevo, and it's actually south of it, which would be a pretty good indication if it was physically raised that the entirety of the village was under Russian control. But we don't actually see Russian soldiers in the video, and so for now we have to just err on the side of caution and not say that it is entirely under Russian control, even though a lot of sources are beginning to indicate that, not just today, but also yesterday on March 16th, they were talking about that fact. So for now, I'm just showing that partially Guevo is under Russian control because definitely there has been movement both to the north and to the east of the town by the 177th Regiment, and they have been able to enter certain portions of it at the very least. But it could be even more than that at this point. It's just a matter of confirming it because Ukrainian sources like Deep St. Petrenko still assert the entirety of the town remains under their control. And same thing with Gornal. Now, besides that, you also have large swaths of forested areas that definitely have fallen into Russian hands. And as a result, they've captured 15.7 square kilometers. Again, a large amount of these holdings that the Ukrainians took over in rapid succession are now being taken back in a similar fashion by the Russian side without much resistance in these open areas because, first of all, there aren't any trenches. The manpower that the Ukrainians have is not in Kursk Oblast anymore. There is a small garrison that remains over here near Gornal, but they're focused on defensive efforts to prevent the Russians from entering into those villages, not on defending individual forest patches. And so then it gives an opportunity for the vacuum to be filled by advancing Russian forces, of course. Now, when it comes to Sujo, we all know of the various videos that have been released by Russian units, regular army, and then the Khabar forces that entered in later on, filming in Goncharovka and Zaloshenko. We all know of that. We also know of the claims by Ukrainian and Russian sources alike of the capture of Rubenshino, and then also all the various tree lines and ditches located to its northwest captured recently by the Russian side. which amount to 13 square kilometers of territory. So definitely this village has fallen into Russian hands, and it is a smaller one in comparison to Gogolevka, and it's directly connected to it. So now that the Russians have a presence over here, they can naturally advance along the same roads in the same paths and reach into Gogolevka, which is something that is currently reported on by the Russian side that it's contested and that the Russians already have a foothold there. I can't verify that because there isn't a geolocation, but that would indicate that the entire Kursk salient, the entire Kursk Ukrainian positions are right now in their final stages. They're in their waning season. So I would say, besides me marking Guevo as largely under Russian control, this is the most favorable map that you could possibly draw of Ukrainian holdings remaining in Kursk, and it would amount to 74 square kilometers. Although it's almost surely less than this. I'm just erring on the side of caution, obviously. And then based on that, Ukrainians could still be present in Aleshnia near the border crossing, and then also near Gornal and the forested regions adjacent to it. The evacuation of Ukrainian soldiers is difficult in a lot of these regions. So a lot of the vanguard forces, TDF units that were deployed over here, while higher quality, higher caliber units withdrew, a lot of them have not actually left their positions near the border yet, because if they were to expose themselves to Russian reconnaissance crews, they would immediately be fired upon, and they would not have any means of reaching a safe location for several kilometers to the southwest. Even the areas that are in Sumy Oblast right now are under constant, incessant drone attacks from the Rubicon drone elements, and both during the day and during the nights. And not even just Rubicon, there are plenty of other drone crews and drone training centers that have already started implementing these harassment measures across the board, across the highways, through any local route that's possible. And then you also have significant Russian shelling of the border. And so a lot of these forces are just holed up in positions in basements or in forested patches, just waiting for the right opportunity to withdraw. That's a part of why they've not left the entire salient yet, and why there is a bit of a dragged out process. But really, we're looking at a matter of days, not anything more than that in some of these regions. And you could also see that based on the pace of the Russian advances. Besides that, we also know of the Russians advancing a bit deeper into Basivka. Not all of it is under their control, but a large chunk of it is. You could see over here, March 15th, the Alcor drone unit of the 116th Brigade, they released footage of their grenade drops and FPV strikes onto individual Russian soldiers as they were advancing from Novenke, because there was a local route over here into Basivka, and then also strikes in the center of the town, which is what we see in the geolocation. So definitely there are Russian efforts to assert themselves over here permanently, and doing so would, first of all, end any hope of holding on to the Kursk salient and whatever remains, because obviously its western flank would then be extremely compromised for whatever forces are near the border. And then it would also solidify the front line in such a way that would allow the Russians to advance along the R200 towards an area like Loknaya and the previous, I suppose, nearby logistics hub being Unikivka. But of course, right now, reaching Unikivka is extremely difficult because of the range of FPVs. And really, the entire R200 highway is littered with the various destroyed vehicles of the Ukrainian side that have not yet been reached by the Russian side. And so eventually they will arrive at these locations, and then you'll see even more footage of trophies and of destroyed equipment. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.